Oncogenic rearrangements involving RET occur in approximately 1 to 2% of patients with non-small cell lung cancer. And RET rearrangements define a distinct molecular subset of the disease. These patients are typically never smokers, and RET rearrangements don't really overlap with other oncogenic drivers in lung cancer. When RET rearrangements were first discovered in lung cancer around 2012, there were efforts to target it, and at the time, people tried repurposing a lot of multi-kinase inhibitors that just happen to have RET activity. Unfortunately, those trials, mainly single-arm studies, showed relatively modest activity in RET rearranged lung cancer. So we're seeing response rates around 20 to 30%. So with that background, and knowing that these patients, have relatively modest benefits from other forms of therapy, namely chemotherapy, BLUE-667 was developed. So BLUE-667 is a selective RET inhibitor. So it's specifically designed to target RET. And so there's, it's 90 times, greater than 90 times more selective for RET versus VEGF, which was a target of many of those other multi-kinase inhibitors. In preclinical models, BLUE-667 is highly active in RET rearranged lung cancer models, as well as in models involving RET point mutations, so medullary thyroid cancer models. Importantly, in addition to the activity that BLUE-667 has on RET fusion-driven models, it also has activity against the gatekeeper mutation in RET, which is V804, at least preclinical activity. So with that background, a phase 1 study was launched, and it had 2 different parts. Part 1 was the dose escalation phase. That was completed last year. It involved a little over 60 patients and identified the recommended phase 2 dose of 400 milligrams once a day. And so what I'll be presenting is looking at BLUE-667 in the part 2 of this study, which is focused on patients with RET fusion positive lung cancer. And so altogether, about 120 patients were included for the safety portion. So all of these patients were treated at the recommended phase 2 dose of 400 milligrams. And we see that in general, BLUE-667 is quite well tolerated with predominantly grade 1, 2 side effects. In total, 7% of patients required discontinuation of therapy due to adverse events. In terms of efficacy, we did see very promising activity within RET fusion positive lung cancer. So within the subset of 48 patients who have a valuable disease at the date of cutoff, we saw an overall response rate of 58%. And in patients who were prior platinum, patients who had received prior platinum, we saw an impressive response rate of 60%. When we focused on the subgroup of patients with treatment-naive disease, we saw 5 out of the 7 of those patients actually had objective responses, all of which were confirmed. Importantly, this study also showed evidence of intracranial activity. So among patients who had resist measurable brain metastases, we actually saw tumor shrinkage in a majority of those patients. So altogether, this really demonstrates that BLUE-667 is a very promising drug for RET fusion positive lung cancer.
Thank you. In your opinion, why have there not been any approved RET inhibitors to date? How is BLUE-667 different from the others?
Yeah, so the reason other RET inhibitors haven't been approved to date was the earlier generations of RET inhibitors were really these multi-kinase inhibitors where they targeted multiple things, and examples of those would be cabozantinib, vendatinib, and in single-arm studies, they showed only modest effects with high degrees of toxicity, so frequent dose reductions, frequent dose interruptions. It was really post-2012 when we actually knew RET fusions were actually present in lung cancer, where companies have tried to develop more selective RET inhibitors that spare that VEGF inhibition. And so Right now, there are 2 selective RET inhibitors that are in clinical trials. We've talked about BLUE-667, the other being LOXO-292. So both of these agents were designed to specifically target RET.
And what are the next steps for this research?
So the next steps are to continue the ongoing phase 1 study. So this study is still enrolling patients. There are several other cohorts. Most notably, there is a cohort for treatment-naive patients or platinum-naive patients. So I think gaining more data on patients who are treatment-naive, as I mentioned, there are only 7 so far. I think gaining more data in that space will be important, because we've seen all along in the targeted therapy paradigm in lung cancer that if you have one of these oncogenic driver mutations, really targeted therapy should be the priority. And so gaining more clinical data in that space will be important.